En við ætlum að líta út fyrir landsteinana. Kelly Driscoll, sérfræðingur frá greiningarfyrirtækinu er hingað komin og ætlar að fara yfir stöðu og horfur í áliðnaði á heimsvísu. Welcome to the podium, Mr. Driscoll.
Thank you, Sylvia, and thank you to Samál to invite me to speak to you today. And thank you to all of you for welcoming me back to Iceland once again. The aluminium industry has been struggling for recent years. The LME price has declined on average in each of the last 5 years. And earlier this year, it's even fell below $1,500 per ton. So that's a challenge for the aluminium industry. And I'd like to discuss how the aluminium industry has survived the recent downturn. Discuss a bit about aluminium smelting costs. We find that these have also been in decline. And discuss why energy is the key driver. I can't talk about the aluminium industry without discussing China, because China's influence is growing tremendously in the aluminium industry, and I'll discuss about the future of aluminium, and it looks positive. So as I said, if we look back over the past 5 years, the aluminium price has been falling on average over the last 5 years. But if we look at the average cost across the industry, we see that costs have also been declining over the last few years, which is good news, because it means the smelters are able to remain competitive. If we look at the pie chart on the right, we'll see the split between the various inputs in production costs. And typically, alumina and power make up combined about 70% of the cost of production. Typically, the split is about even between the two, but as I'll explain in a few minutes, the power prices have been coming down around the world, which is good. But what you'll find is that the plant manager can really only affect a small portion of the costs on a regular basis through efficiency improvements. And we find that that's happened quite a bit throughout the industry. Alumina tends to be priced on a global basis, on a price index basis, and power, even though it makes up only 30%, a third of the cost of production, it accounts for more than 2/3 of the variability between smelters on the cost curve. So when we see this decline in costs, that's due to the efficiency improvements of the smelters. It's due to a closure of some of the high-cost smelters. It's due to bringing on some lower-cost new greenfield smelters. But it's also due to a decline in power costs around the world. And another thing we'll see is if we look at the industry cost curve, this is comparing one from 10 years ago to 2015, we see that the cost curve has become much flatter in recent years. So, and that first quartile advantage is eroding. So, if we look at the 2005 cost curve at the juncture between the first and second quartile and the third and fourth quartile, there's maybe $600 a ton difference. So there's quite a big differential between the position on the cost curve. If we look now between the junctures between those quartiles, it's only $200 or $300 difference. So what that means is that even a small movement in a key input like a power price can mean a significant shift along the cost curve for that individual producer. So what I've chosen here is to look at global energy and how they've developed over the last few years. So the chart on the left is looking at Brent crude, and we can see that crude prices have fallen by 2/3 since their high point in 2014. And it appears as though they've bottomed out and are starting to rise slowly. In the middle, we've got European traded gas prices. And again, we've seen the gas prices have fallen by about 60%. And it's a similar situation in North America with the U.S. shale gas helping for gas prices to drop by over 50%. But again, in both Europe and North America, we're finding that gas prices have hit a bottom and are starting to climb a bit. And the other key energy is coal, thermal coal. I just chose an example of Australian traded coal here. But again, quite a substantial 40% fall in coal prices. And again, coal prices are starting to rise again. So what we've seen is the global fall in energy input prices is helping to push for a fall in electricity prices. So if we look at a global map of the energy mix for the generation of electricity that's utilized by aluminium smelters around the world, there's a few key things that we note. First of all, Canada is 100% hydroelectric power, and China, which is the biggest producer and the fastest grower, is about 90% coal for the source of power for smelting production. Europe here, it includes Scandinavia and Iceland. That's why there's such a high proportion of hydro and renewables in that mix. And then another growth area is the Middle East, which is primarily gas-based. Hydropower is quite a positive thing and renewable energy, because what we're finding is a lot of the discretionary spend on aluminium, especially by big players, the big names that you know in the transport industry, in the packaging industry, in consumer durables, are looking to source green materials. And so they would prefer to source aluminium that's been produced by hydro or renewables. As I mentioned before, the growth of China as a dominant player in the aluminium industry. If we look back at 2000, China only accounted for about 8% of the world's aluminium production, and it is now over 50%, and we think that's the situation going forward. The traditional developed countries in Western Europe and North America, in the U.S. anyway, are declining in production, has been being replaced by production in the Middle East and in Asia. So let's look a little bit at China and its growth. Again, the traditional Chinese aluminium smelting production was on the coast, but now we see less and less production on the coast, and more movement to the west, where there's substantial quantities of coal available, and the other thing that we're seeing in the shift is from purchase power, which comes from the grid, to self-generated power. Because in general, in China, self-generated power is cheaper than purchase power, than grid power. Although we have seen quite considerable reforms of the way that power is priced in the country. We've seen significant grid reforms, but we've also seen reforms that allow self-generated power to be consumed by the producer at cost, rather than adding on grid tariffs. So the size of these bars here shows the provinces that have the largest production, and that proportion of self-generated power has grown to almost two-thirds of China's production now. So this is quite an interesting chart in terms of the price of power to China's aluminium industry. So these blue bars, what they represent is the ratio of the average price of power the China aluminium smelting industry to the average price of power in the rest of the world. And historically, that was about a 2-to-1 ratio. It fell a little bit when during global development and prices were rising, power prices were rising elsewhere, but then went back up to over 2. But what we've seen in recent years is the average price of power is coming down in China due to market reforms, due to closures of smelters in the coastal regions, and the opening of massive new smelters in the West with self-generated power at very low rates. And so what we've seen is that ratio has finally fallen below 1.5 and is likely to remain in that region going forward. So that's what's making the Chinese players more competitive on a global market. Their costs of power is coming down, and they continue to have cheap labor and much lower capital costs. So what I thought I'd do is look at a few key regions in terms of how they might compare. So again, Canada, 100% hydropower. Canada was trying to push through what they call an L rate, which is essentially a fixed price power, which was in the high $40 per megawatt hour range, and combined with a weak aluminium market, a strong Canadian currency, it was looking very likely to force closures of smelters rather than encourage new power contracts. So what we've seen instead is a shift to LME-linked power, which is relatively, it's quite common in some parts of the world, but relatively new to Canada. So that shift from fixed price to LME-linked, and then has actually led to quite considerable growth in Canadian aluminium production. If we look at the U.S., the U.S. mix is mostly or predominantly coal, but the emergence of shale gas has helped to push down gas prices, which has pushed down coal prices in the U.S. And what we've seen is power prices were tending to rise in the U.S. And were exceptionally high for some of the Century smelters. And what they've managed to do is shift to market-priced power, and that's brought power costs down quite considerably for those smelters. And then for the other smelters, this shift down is more about closing of high-cost smelters rather than any renegotiations. So what it means is, on average, power costs have come down, but the production numbers have gone down considerably because high-cost power is forcing the closure of smelters in the U.S. And then a third example, looking at Western Europe, again, predominantly hydropower, and the rest is mostly mixed based on the grids in Central Europe. So we see a combination here of, first of all, very high power rates for a lot of Europe, and that forced the closure of considerable amount of capacity in 2012. And then the way the smelters have survived is through a combination of market reforms, through a shift to market-priced power for, especially in Central Europe, has helped to push down, and also the strong dollar, weak euro. If we look at it on a dollar per megawatt hour basis, power prices have fallen by more than half in Germany, and again that leads to falling power costs and a rise in production. We see that trend. High power costs tends to lead to close down of smelters. Lower power cost tends to improve production. So I'm going to move away from cost of production and talk about the future of aluminium a little bit. So this is the S-curve of aluminium demand. And so what you find with the S-curve is the developed economies have quite a high a ratio there. And then the developed countries tend to be on the starting point of that curve. What we find is that China, through its infrastructural growth, has become quite aluminium intensive, and we expect it to remain so, probably following the path of South Korea. Another interesting point on this chart that I added in was just looking at the trend in metal consumption, comparing aluminium to the other base metals. Aluminium has always had strong demand, and if we go back for the last 45 years, aluminium has outperformed all of the other base metals and continues to do so at an elevated pace. So if we look at global aluminium demand growth over the next 10 years, we see a compound annual growth rate of around 3.5% around the world, which is good, because if you look at GDP growth or IP growth forecasts for globally, they're mostly in the 2.5% to 3% range. So aluminium is outperforming GDP growth and IP growth. But the real drivers of growth, again, it's no longer going to be China, but more Southeast Asia and India especially. And the reason why aluminium demand is so strong is because it's wide variety of uses. It's used in a whole range of different sectors, and because of that, it tends to remain strong throughout the cycles, the economic cycles. So what we see here for construction specifically, construction growth is likely to be quite low. So that hurts the steel industry because 85% of steel is used in construction industry. But it doesn't hurt the aluminium industry so bad because other sectors, especially transport, are growing very strongly. Transport, that's specifically in automotive and ground transport with the light weighting vehicles. Aluminium is the ideal material for that purpose. Also, you'll see the rapid growth of airplanes coming into Iceland and other tourist destinations, and there's need for new airplane construction, and that also adds to transport growth. And so if we look at the primary aluminium market balance, for a market that's roughly 55 million tons, these surpluses of a few 100,000 tons don't make a huge difference. But what we're seeing developing for about the past 4 or 5 years is that China is in surplus and the rest of the world is in deficit in terms of aluminium production. This has led to some extent to the troubles that the industry has faced because China hasn't always had the market discipline that the rest of the world is facing. But we do see exports continuing to come out of China, and probably continuing to grow, but not overwhelming the market. And so if we look at long-term growth requirements, the dotted lines here show the demand growth for aluminium. So we've got China on the right, and the rest of the world on the left. And what we see is the rest of the world will continue to be in deficit, but will require quite significant growth in new capacity. China will continue to be in surplus, but we'll still see growth in capacity because the existing capacity will continue to shut down. So we're going to continue to see the migration in China from the coastal regions to further afield. But what this means is that for all this growth to take place, the price of the metal is very likely to rise. It's to rise up to a long-run price, which is going to be well over $2,000 a ton, which will encourage the investment required to take place. And our view is that's likely to take place. We think costs have hit a low point now. Maybe they'll stay low for a year or two, but eventually they're going to start rising, pushed up by energy prices. So in conclusion, we've seen primary aluminum smelting costs in decline, but they're probably at a low point in the cycle. Costs will rise, but also prices will rise. Energy is the key driver for aluminum smelter competitiveness and makes the most differential on the position of the cost curve. We've seen aluminum smelter power rates fall in many regions, especially in dollar terms. China continues to be a huge player, and its unpredictability is the real bugbear in the market, especially going forward. But the real good news is that aluminum demand has been strong and remains very strong, which will push up the prices. And the other thing is that I mentioned briefly is that green producers of primary metal from renewable energy are likely to find pricing differentials grow in the future. Thank you very much.